An awful lot of people talk about counterterrorism, but there's thinking about counterterrorism and there's doing counterterrorism. Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada, and you're listening to Canadian Intelligence, podcast about national security and public safety. Okay, I know you've heard it 1,000 times before, but you're going to hear it again. In all the time that I spent in intelligence, which is 32 years plus, I was very much a coalface kind of guy. I was at first a multilingual analyst for the Communication Security Establishment, CSIE, which is Canada's Signals Intelligence Organization, working in Arabic and Farsi, a bunch of other languages as well. And then I joined the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, where I was an analyst looking at Islamist extremism. But I considered myself very much to be a kind of hands-on kind of guy. I wasn't an investigator. I wasn't an agent. I didn't recruit human sources, although I debriefed a lot of human sources. But I felt very much that in order to understand the threat to Canada and by extension our allies, whether it's allies in NATO or NAFTA or whatever, that I had to understand what the operators were actually finding. As a consequence to that, I've got a real bias towards people like me who did spend time actually doing these things. And this is no disrespect intended to let's say, academics who write papers, and there have been thousands and thousands of papers and books written, especially since 9/11, about terrorism. But to me, learning from the experiences of those who actually did the same work that I did, I find very, very beneficial. So for this podcast, I'm absolutely beyond thrilled to have with me on the podcast Brig Barker, who spent 21 years as an FBI agent, majority investigating and supervising counterterrorism and informant operations. He's written this fascinating new book that I couldn't put down, entitled The Dark Trajectory of Jihad, an FBI agent's understanding of the life, mindset, and intentions of radical extremism. And he's joining me on the line from Colorado. So, Brig, thank you so much for giving me the time, buddy.
Thank you so much, Phil. I'm a big fan, and I'm very excited to be here with another practitioner.
Let's get right into it, Brig. As I said in your book, the more I read it, the more I saw myself. I almost thought I was always going to maybe sue you for plagiarism at one point because because a lot of what you were saying I'd written as well. But there's something really interesting you wrote very early in the book, and you wrote, "The road to radicalization is not a flat paved road, but more of a muddy overland trail with many unforeseeable undulations." It's a great line. What did you mean by that sentence, Brig?
Well, Phil, I mean, as you know, we talk a little bit about radicalization. We see it in the movies. It comes out in presentations every once in a while. There's media splash, every once in a while after a terrorist attack. But the reality for me, kind of watching it up close, really as my own personal movie, is it's very convoluted, it's confusing, it's complex. So it's not just straightforward and simple and pure nature. So, I mean, for me in general, Phil, the way I saw it after interviewing so many of these guys over just about 20 years is, the road of radicalization is really three pieces. One is the entry onto the road itself, and then kind of the exit phase. And so amongst those three phases, the way I categorize them is the entry part was always unpredictable. How someone ended up there, whether it was, he felt invisible, he perceived some grievances, or he just wanted his 15 minutes of fame, right? We never knew how he was going to get on the road. And then the road itself, after really many years, I saw this very predictable phase that I kind of broke down and started understanding. And it was visceral for me when I'd interview them. I could fairly quickly kind of take in, how radical someone was and what their trajectory was. And then the third phase was that kind of exit piece where they would either just kind of fizzle out and disappear, or they were triggered to action by a mentor, or they headed in a different direction, whatever it may be. But I always kind of saw it as three phases, and with that, I think inherently it is complicated, and things happen along the way, and then many other factors that we can certainly discuss that I think make it a very bumpy, muddy road with a lot of undulations, Phil.
You've probably seen the same model that I've seen, Brig. There's the four-step model, there's the three-step. There's all kinds of models that academics have come up with over the years. I believe the NYPD, way back in the mid 2000s, came up with some kind of a four-step model. Is it fair to say, based on your experience and based on this notion that these multiple undulations, is it fair to say that radicalization really is an individualized process?
I would say it absolutely is. I don't think we can just place, kind of a standard template over any of these situations. It's kind of like when I teach interviewing. There's all these schools, and I'm sure you have them in Canada. Of they teach these are the steps whenever you interview a criminal. You
Right.
have to follow these steps and things like that. And I'm just not a fan of the schools. I believe that every one of them is very individualized. And with radicalization, there's three axes: there's X, Y, and Z. And so as we're analyzing it, and as we're recruiting into it and all of this, we have to be it's much more, I would say, of an art than a science. So yeah, I would say that I think we hold everything with an open hand. Every situation's different. I used to look at every time I was going to interview somebody, or someone would say, "Hey, can you come interview this guy with me?" I'd say, "What country is he from?" So then
Hmm.
we have cultural
Right.
implications. Is he from the Maghreb? Is he from Egypt? Is he from Scandinavia? Whatever it may be. So you have all of this that builds into all these different axes that we've got to read, and we can't miss, a potential plot that's brewing.
Why is it you think that we're so beholden to models? Is it a human need to understand? Is it a human need to oversimplify? But as you said, whether you're a law enforcement officer or an intelligence agent or whatever, you've got to go into a given situation open enough to figure out where what's the best strategy. What buttons do you need to push to get this person to talk? I should remind my listeners that you were fluent in Arabic, which meant you can actually deal with these guys in the language that most of them spoke. Why is it that we seem to have this craving for an oversimplification of the radicalization process?
Well, Phil, I think, first of all, I'm just going to make a blanket indictment that we don't even understand this threat. We're this many 20 years after 9 11, and the threat started long before that. We don't even know the first leg of the letter of A in the alphabet as to
Wow.
this threat, whether you're a citizen, whether you're, in law enforcement, military, intel. We should all, all these people should have been, provided this kind of training along the way, but we just don't understand it. So if we don't understand it, it's almost like, and I'm gonna use a Canadian reference. I hope it doesn't make you mad, but if I was gonna step on the ice and pick up hockey for the first time, I need some kind of model where
Right.
I know some basics of this is what I should do and this is what I shouldn't do. And I think, Phil, we're kind of stuck back in kindergarten or first
Mhm,
grade with this threat. So we're all kind of craving a model of, I don't even know what to look for. Give me something. So
mhm.
I remember as a brand new FBI agent when I started in Los Angeles, I was assigned to an Asian organized crime squad, and I didn't know anything about this particular threat. Didn't learn anything about it, at the academy. And I think I was craving, give me something, tell me
Mhm.
something about the culture, help me understand their MO and things like that. So I think the problem is kind of the fruit of the poisonous tree here as we're discussing it is we're so in the beginning of understanding this threat. That's why we have these basic models. But radicalization as a whole is a deep ocean, as you and I both know. And I think that you and I, would certainly look at it very differently and analyze it very differently than a lot of people. But so many people coming into this, they're looking for some kind of infrastructure, really, to understand it.
Not surprisingly, Brig, I'm nodding as you're speaking. We're going to return to that question about whether we really understand this threat, because I'm with you. I think people have moved on over the past 20 years for all the wrong reasons, but we'll get back to that in a second. Another interesting chapter in your book talked about ideologues. You just used the word mentors as well. In your experience looking at radicalization, interviewing the people that you did, just how important was the role of the ideologue slash mentor in this radicalization to violence process?
Yeah, so I'm, very hyper focused and obsessed with the ideologue as part of an investigation, um, for a couple different reasons. But the primary reason is, especially if you have a new convert, someone who's looking for direction and who's looking for ideological, but I'll say theological answers on what their role is and things like that. They look to the ideologue. They look to someone who's charismatic, who
Mhm.
may have some insight into where this person or where this group should go. And so I think the ideologue, and again, you have as with a new convert, it's kind of like clay.
Yeah.
So they're brand new. They're taking in the Quran, they're taking the Hadith, they're learning from the fatwas, they're learning from sermons, they're watching videos and all this. But the ideologue Socratically is guiding them somewhere. So the
Mhm.
ideologue, just as a point of reference and direction, is really critical. He's shaping the scenario, and if he's radical, then he's shaping it potentially towards an attack. So that, to me, that's why the ideologue is so critical. And the other piece, kind of at the advanced level, right, that we could discuss more is, if we could recruit the ideologue, then
Yes.
that's a force multiplier for us on the intelligence side.
Exactly, and especially as you mentioned, Converse is a very good example of how someone who's, let's face it, their knowledge is very piss poor, and so they don't have the wherewithal to really understand what they've just gotten into, and that's where the ideologue and the mentor comes in. Berger and I was working at the security service in Canada throughout the 2000s and 2010s. The one name that kept coming up, and you talk about him in your book, is Awlaki, or Awlaki as he's called in English, the Yemeni American. I can't think of a single investigation where he didn't show up. Maybe not in person, but people were downloading his sermons, downloading his books. Did you find the same thing in the United States that, if you're looking at an American, whether it's a convert or born Muslim who was getting into this particular rigmarole, that Aulaki was generally lurking either in the background or the foreground?
Yeah, Phil. I mean, Alaki, of course, is just a thorn in the side, even long after he died in 2011. I think and honestly, we could probably spend hours talking about
Yes,
Alaki.
yes, yes, we could.
Right. Yeah, when I was working, in this realm, and I had, I'd been an agent in it for years. I had run a couple of the big joint terrorism task forces. So I'm managing cases and we were running, sources and all that. Um, I was listening to his sermons. And to be
Mhm.
honest with you, I was very underwhelmed by Alaki. I listened
Really?
to him versus I was listening, I always want to understand the enemy, right? So, versus listening to some of the other very charismatic, kind of jihadist, godfathers of jihad type
Mhm.
folks. And Alaki, I was just never that impressed with him, but he spoke English. And I think that was a thread
Exactly.
that really helped, especially the newer converts, those that are more superficial in their understanding of Islam, and so or the fence sitters. There was some draw to Al-Awlaki, and so yeah, the guy just popped up continuously. I worked in San Diego, for 4 years.
Mm.
Of course, Al-Awlaki was there. He was then in Virginia, before he went to Yemen. And then I was at DoD Special Operations Command. I was embedded with them in 2011. So I kind of was along the way. I could see him as I looked over in the distance everywhere I was. But yeah, people were just obsessed with him. But again, someone who didn't have religious credentials, ijaza, right? Kind of
Yep.
like Osama bin Laden didn't have ijaza, didn't have
Yep.
the religious credentials. And so, I always look at someone who's following these people off a cliff and I say, are you really following someone who didn't even study and get their credentials, into the abyss? It amazes me.
It's funny you talk about Aulaki, and I couldn't agree with you more that he was really important. But I always felt that in some ways he was kind of if you remember the film The Jewel of the Nile back in '85
Sure,
with
sure.
with Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner, there was this goofy kind of guy who was an Islamic cleric, and I always thought he looked like Olaki. But um, it's true that, I mean, I've always said that, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man rules. And if you've got
That's
a
right.
bunch of people that can't spell Islam and don't
Right,
understand what it means to them, a guy with a little bit of knowledge can get people into a lot of trouble. And
right.
hence, there's notion of that, why the mentorship is so great. And the other thing too, of course, the other phrase that has always really pissed me off. I'm not sure how you feel about it. I get apoplectic when I people hear people say self-radicalized. I said, listen, nobody, repeat, nobody self-radicalizes. There's always somebody helping you along the way, whether it's virtual or in your own life or whatever. But nobody has all the answers. And so, can we please ditch this notion of self-radicalization? Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, but Phil, if you don't understand this threat, if you're the media, okay, I'll just toss that out there, and
Yeah.
you're trying to give your viewership some answers, and you don't understand this at all, you're going to use that term because it sounds cool. Yeah. Who's self-radicalized? Well, everyone's influenced by something, someone,
Yeah.
and I often teach on this, in depth of what to look for, from a practitioner standpoint. But yeah, and the other one I love to hear, Phil, is radicalized by the internet.
Yeah. What does that even
Yeah,
mean?
right, right. But I get that the internet propaganda on the internet is fuel to a fire, but it's not going to be the sole string puller, as far as radicalizing someone. So I'll just say amen to what you just said.
Well, and the internet as a vehicle, internet isn't an actor. It's something that serves as a medium through which information is passed on. You have to go and seek the information, and so therefore the internet itself is not radicalizing you. Excuse me. Maybe,
Right.
but you could, in your book you talk a lot about the interviews you've done, both in the United States and abroad. And can you walk us through, just in general terms, your approach to doing an interview with either a target, somebody on your investigation, or somebody you're trying to recruit as a source? What were the kinds of things that you tried to do to gain the intelligence that was necessary to understand the nature of the threat to the United States?
Yeah. So Phil, again, to your point of every one of these situations is very individualistic, right? That's how I approached it. Once I started figuring things out, I spent about 2 years after 9/11 with different, interview approaches from my criminal, investigative days, and it wasn't working. People were standing up and walking out of the room, and I'm like, what's going
Oh,
on? What I was using with the serial killer is not working with this radical jihadist. And so
right.
I started making things up, Phil. I was just literally throwing pasta against the wall, and I started finding a couple things that were working for me. And so I never left rapport-based interviewing. That, and I ended up teaching at our academy for a couple of years, the FBI Academy. I never left rapport-based, interviewing. That always worked for me. And it's the whole thing of what works for you, right? And so
Right.
that was always kind of a tenet, right up front. And if I could kind of get over the hump of I built rapport, everything just got easier after that. But and I was very dedicated and focused on building the rapport because that was always the hardest piece. If I could do that, then I actually built my own interrogation technique, Phil. And
Oh,
basically, what it was I build rapport, and then I would let them talk for an hour. Like I would
right.
pretty much, encourage their train of thought, nod my head, tell me more about this, help me better understand, the sunnah or whatever it was. I've heard this term, kufar.
Yep.
What does that mean to you?
Right.
So
Right.
I let them talk for an hour, right? And then I could almost set my watch to it. And then what I did is I started asking them questions threaded with kind of critical node questions. So in there, those particular, I will call them bipolar questions. So it's kind of a yes or no answer. I would start to graph it in my mind on, if you could picture a line, of to the right is radical, to the left is moderate, I could start a kind of a skew with dots of how radical they were. That's how I ended up. So some of my typical questions, I would toss these in. So, I'd say something, very innocuous, like, wow, you moved here 3 years ago. Was that difficult for you and your family? And then the next question may be, what is the answer to, violence in the Middle East? And then, as you know, let silence prevail, because
Yeah,
silence compels people to talk. Or I
absolutely.
would say, I've heard this term tawheed, monotheism.
Mm,
What is that? How is that defined? And so what I would find is that if I had rapport, and and I don't want to go into this and take up too much time, but if I had rapport, they were very honest with me. And so if I
mhm.
said, hey, what does this term kafir mean? They'd say infidel. In fact, you as a Christian are a kafir. Then I knew I was getting somewhere. So
Yeah.
I would basically chart that on that line, and I would walk away generally knowing, I think after probably about 10 years is when I started getting my legs under me with this. I would feel comfortable going back to the office and saying, this is how radical this guy is. Now, his direction from there and triggers and all that, that was unknown, but at least I had a sense of where he was in that snapshot.
Well, and it certainly sounds like a very successful technique, Brig. I mean, you've done, I don't know how many interviews, but I'm sure quite a bit. And the fact that the FBI still has you as an instructor, I think speaks volumes. The other thing, of course, and I think that many listeners maybe don't realize this is that with people like you and I or in these interviews, we're not just there to try to figure out what threat the person poses to Canada, United States, the West in general. We're also there in an effort to turn them, i.e., turn them into a source, turn them into a human agent. If we can convince them that it's better off for them and their families if they work for us rather than work against us. Without getting into details, because I can appreciate the sensitivity of it, were you at all successful in turning some of the so-called people under investigation into assets for the FBI?
Well, I think that, of course, that is the goal, Phil, right? I think we all had the common goal of, if someone is intended towards harming others, suicide bomber, V-bed attack on a military base or whatever, that was our focus. And so, yeah, we wanted to, first talk to them and see, is this true? Because sometimes, as you know, the computer and the phone records and the bank records say something, but when you go sit with them for 3 hours, oftentimes you'll get a different answer, right?
Right, right,
Um, but that was always the goal. Was, if this guy is intending to carry out an attack, what can we do to stop it? Whatever techniques we can use there to stop it or disrupt it. But if he's an ideologue, right, then and if we can recruit him, then maybe we can turn the Titanic completely 180 degrees and get
exactly.
5 of these guys to not do what they're doing. So, I think that's, without kind of going into details, as far as tactics, techniques, procedures, and all that, that was the goal. And, I think that we used anything we could, whether it was, hey, we found immigration fraud with this guy, let's prosecute him for that and
Right.
let's disrupt it that way. Or if it was, they were robbing gas stations to fund their jihad, then, indict them for the gas station robberies, or, whatever it was. Our goal was, obviously to disrupt it, whether it was through some charges, some prosecution, or to, recruit and leverage them against anybody else in the cell, and just to, keep everybody safe.
Well, and as you know as well as I do, Brig, if you can recruit somebody who has the bona fides, the charisma, and is trusted by the cell to be working for you, man, you've got it made. I mean, that's what we did in the Toronto 18 back in 05, 06. We recruited the guy that was basically giving them the arms training out in the middle of nowhere
Right.
winter in 2005. That's kind of the gold standard, isn't it? If you get somebody that can actually, he's now working for you, and he knows more about them than they know about themselves, and he's sharing that information with you guys as law enforcement. That's kind of, you've won the game when that happens.
You guys did a tremendous job on that case. I'm familiar with it, and that is the gold standard. That's the the touchdown.
Yep.
Of then the nooks and crannies, right? Like, I can only gain so much intelligence on a cell, but if there's a guy in there, even if he's conflicted or he's a wannabe or a hanger on type folk, we can get some intel from him about the atmospherics, the direction, the mechanics of it. But like you said, if you can get the ideologue or the financier or
Yeah,
somebody that holds an important role in this cell, then the water starts flowing, right? It's not stagnant anymore. And so
yeah,
we get a lot of answers that way. And it also, I think, shapes strategy. So if you and I are sitting around the table with some other folks, practitioners and some analysts, and we've recruited somebody, and he comes in and he says, here's what's going on. Tomorrow night we're going to the storage unit, we're purchasing this, the
yeah,
timeline is this, like, then we can develop the best concept of an operation or strategy to
exactly.
disrupt this. So it really is efficient, and it helps us along as well.
Let me ask you an unfair question, and feel free to punt this one if you don't feel comfortable. One of the criticisms I think that was brought to bear about the American intelligence community writ large in the aftermath of 9/11 was that perhaps there had been too much of an emphasis on SIGINT, so signals intelligence, where I used to work at CSE, so the NSA equivalent in your country, and not enough emphasis on human or human intelligence. So, in other words, in your country, like you get, I think they're called FISA warrants you can get to intercept
Right.
communications.
Right.
We call them Part 6 warrants if you're law enforcement, Section 21 warrants if you're intelligence. It was that a fair criticism, Break, back in '01, that maybe there was SIGINT was seen as the end all and be all, and human kind of took a bit of a backstage.
Yeah, I think Phil, for so many of us, 9/11 was such a wake up call. And that's very cliche. But I think the greatest thing, that happened in American intelligence is we needed to put warm bodies into this investigation, right? So
Mhm.
what they did, and I wasn't working terrorism at the time and didn't really know much about it outside of my deployment to Nairobi, Kenya, '98 for the embassy bombings. But what we did is we brought all these agents and intel analysts that have been working gangs and been working organized crime into this, and they knew that human was so important, right? So it was, how do we recruit, how do we do this human piece in this realm, right?
Mhm.
So I think what happened is, just kind of by way of necessity, is all these warm bodies came in, and all they knew were, I just got done working Crips and Bloods, I just got
Yeah.
done working La Cosa Nostra. And how do you work those and disrupt those? And it's a complex case, is human. And yeah, you're going to have SIGINT and you're going to have the other ints, but the human piece, is really so important. And I'll add the kind of bolt on people that know how to talk to people, right? So that's
Yeah.
the other thing that we brought in is agents that they spend so much time in a gang case interviewing people. So you bring in those types of folks, those kind of soldiers that you build the human quickly because they know how to do it. It's just understanding this threat, which again I will say we're struggling, because the training is not there. It's not fair to the cop on the street in New York because he hasn't received the training he needs, or the intel folks or the DoD folks. And so, but at least we brought in that human need and the interviewing piece.
I can honestly say, Briggs, that the cases that I worked on at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the successful uh, plots that we prevented were all plots in which we had a very, very highly praised human source. Like I said, that knew more about the target than the target knew about his or himself. So again, I think you make some good points about how critical it was and how, let's face it, investigating and Crips and Bloods or Cosa Nostra is not quite the same as interviewing jihadis. It's a different beast, and maybe we were ill prepared, and maybe I don't know. Did we kind of think that the threat wasn't as important as it really was, or anyhow? I mean, hindsight's 2020. You know as much as I do, and I'm not here
Sure.
going to sit here and criticize U.S. intelligence or Canadian intelligence, whatever kind of thing. Another part of your book, you talk about females, and this has gotten a lot more attention in recent years. A number of books have come out by academics. I want to talk a bit about the San Bernardino attack in December of 2015. And this is where a couple decided to attack a Christmas party in San Bernardino. It was Syed Rizwan Farouk and his wife Tashfeen Malik. They ended up killing 14 people, wounded 22 others before they in turn were killed by law enforcement. In your book, you talk about Tashfeen's role. You seem to indicate that you thought she was much more if not the leader, the instigator of the attack itself, which you would think that most of us would kind of be surprised at. How could a woman, especially a woman under an Islamist plot, where let's face it, in many versions of Islam, especially Jihadi Islam, women do take a sort of a back step. Why was it you think that Tashfin was much more the person in front in that attack?
Well, and I think it's a timely question, Phil. We're seeing so much going on, right, in Iraq and Syria, and kind of the fallout from ISIS and the ISIS brides and things like that. Um, and so specifically going back to 2015 with the San Bernardino attack, which was a horrific attack, right? Um, I think that there's markers for me with that. And we know a little bit about the backstory of her and him, and it's kind of how the marriage kind of was connected through the internet. But for me, I look at a couple important markers. One is, the day of the attack, she pledged bayat to, Baghdadi of ISIS on Facebook. Like
Oh,
that was,
I didn't know that. Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
she was, I'll say, it was kind of from my old army days, like breaking brush with a machete in a way.
Yeah.
She ideologically, pledged that support to Baghdadi on the day of through Facebook. So to me, and he didn't. So to me, in a way, that puts her just a little bit ahead of him, right? I'm giving him no pass, right? Second, she fired the first shots at the cops in the shootout that ended up leaving both of them dead. So
Mhm.
again, and that's kind of the tactical, the operational level. Again, to me, that's her kind of leading. And again, I'm not giving this guy a break in any way. And then I think and this is all through open source, Phil, you can pull this up. But the other piece is I always look at, where did you go to college? Where was that changing point, that turning point that may have led someone down the road of radicalization? And there's a possibility that happened at the Al Huda Institute in Pakistan for
Mhm.
her. If you kind of take in the atmospherics of that, university, and of course it was all whitewashed by the university afterwards. But
Typical.
I
Yeah.
tend to
Yeah.
not buy any of that. So,
Yeah.
some of those things I look at, even if she was a little bit ahead of him, I still feel like she tended to, kind of lead it a little bit more than him.
I'm really glad you brought up ISIS. So, there's been in your country as well as mine this big debate. What do we do with the wives of ISIS? So, these women who went from Canada, United States, United Kingdom, Europe. You talk about Tunisia. I was in Tunisia a couple of years ago. You talk about how Tunisia was incredibly an important source for ISIS fighters, much disproportionately to its population. I remember sitting down with a Tunisian counterterrorism guy, and he said, "Well, we estimate there's probably about 6,000 went, but we also stopped 21,000 from going. So
Hmm.
who wanted to go join ISIS, but it's this notion that these poor women who were forced to join ISIS, who followed their husbands, or were coerced in doing so, and I'm thinking, really, they had no agency." And I don't know if you've come across this, Brig. We used to joke at the service that whenever we interviewed somebody who'd spent time abroad, whether it's up with Al Shabaab or Al Qaeda or whatever, and we'd ask them, what did you do when you were over there? We used to get two stock answers. The first one was, I just drove the bus. And the second was, I just served tea. Not a goddamn person picked up a gun, built an IED, did anything. And I'm sensing the same thing with the women, is that they're all playing the victim here. And I don't know what's happening in the United States, but in my country, there's actually a lobby group suing the Canadian government for not rescuing these women
Hmm.
from their fate. I'm thinking, joining a terrorist group is a pretty stupid decision in the first place. And, there has to be a penalty for that. But anyhow, that's a whole other conversation. Brig, I want to sort of finish off this conversation with something you alluded to earlier. And you talk about in the very end of the book, you sort of wither Islamist extremism. And I've been getting on my high horse for years now. I'm really nervous that for a lot of people, what we call Islamist extremism, or euphemistically or stupidly in my country, religiously motivated violent extremism, which is a nonce term, typical bureaucratic term, that this chapter is somehow over. and that all we need to focus on now is the far right, be they white nationalists, white supremacists. Some people throw the QAnon in there, the incels for some people, which I disagree with. We know it's a huge issue in your country. Absolutely, it's a smaller issue here in Canada, but it still exists. Are we missing the boat? I mean, is Islamist extremism really yesterday's problem? And we can wash our hands saying, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Let's move on to something else. Or I kind of know where your answer is going to go here, but I thought I would leave the question open-ended, at least at the beginning.
Yeah. So, Phil, I have to start back with ISIS, right? Go back to 2014, right? The burgeoning threat, Mosul, which we know accelerated to 30, 45,000 foreign fighters in country. And, certainly at some point, maybe we'll get together and talk for 5 hours on the history of, jihadist terrorism, Al Qaeda baseline, 80s, 90s, all that. But I feel like ISIS, that kind of time of ISIS, that swath of land, the caliphate was a chamber. And these foreign fighters came in and they learned certain things. They learned this, what I call, micro theology, right?
Mm.
As far as how they believe. They learned how to use encrypted communications. They learned how to build a network. They learned how to, build a vehicle-borne ID. They learned all these things, and then things kind of changed, and a lot of them went back to their countries, right?
Yeah.
A lot of them went back to Philippines or Canada or Europe or I worked in Tunisia at one point. Back to Tunisia or to the U.S. And so this kind of, I call it ISIS diaspora, right? They went out, kind of as part of these sub franchises, and they're amongst us now, right? So I mean, I would start number one, with that. Now number two, I would say, I don't know. I'm not in the skiff anymore, monitoring briefings and all that. But what I do see on the news is that I've seen more ISIS related plots disrupted in the U.S. in the last 2 years than I've seen in 20 something years.
Yeah.
So that tells me it hasn't gone away, right? I would never, declare myself as basically an expert on domestic terrorism, all these things you mentioned, incels and all that. I don't really know much about it. I never really cared too much, to be honest with you, because I was always working against some plot, from ISIS, Al Qaeda, some homegrown violent extremists. That's where I lived. I was, I spoke Arabic. Like that was my space. But what I know is this is great for ISIS. This is great for the HVE because
Yeah.
if whatever countries are focused on, what may be happening on the domestic terrorism side, that gives me time and space to plan, to procure, to do surveillance, reconnaissance, to do dry runs. I can do all these things. So the only thing I would say is make sure we're keeping an eye on the jihadist threat, because they will, as we know, they will plan for years, and it's not going to be good at the end of that for any of us. The carnage of 9/11, or here Boston bombers, or Orlando, or San Bernardino, or Fort Hood, with Nidal Hassan. So my concern is that we say, gee, it's over, we've wrapped up in a bow and it's done. They love that, so don't let that happen. So that's the tip of the iceberg for me as far as opinion, Phil, on that, and maybe you as well. But that's kind of where I land.
Well, surprise, surprise, Brig. I'm completely in agreement with you, and not just because like you, I specialize in Islamist extremism for a decade and a half, and have written 6 books on the topic. But even a cursory glance at the news, and unlike you, I don't have access to intel anymore. I lost my access 6.5 years ago, but just from an open source scan alone, on a given day, anywhere in the world, there's a half dozen or a dozen attacks, and all of them are carried out by jihadis, whether it's in Mozambique or Pakistan or Afghanistan or the Philippines or Morocco or whatever, or the West. This isn't neo-Nazis carrying out this stuff. Not to say that neo-Nazis don't pose a threat, they do. But if we're thinking that, like you said, we can wrap this up in a bow, we're completely, we're bonkers. And I just worry that there's political pressure, there's cancel culture pressure. I don't know if you've seen, but there's even pressure to stop calling it Islamist extremism. That's some kind of Islamophobic or racist term, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. But Anyhow, listen, Brig, you mentioned about a 5 hour talk. Well, there is a beer with your name on it. Um, Next time if we meet, whether it's in Colorado or up here in Canada, but I just say I want to thank you first and foremost for your service to your country with the FBI, the work you did to keep your country and your citizens safe, and secondly, thank you for joining me on what has turned out to be one of the best podcasts I've made in the past a couple of years. And you truly know your stuff. Your book is fascinating. I'll put a link to it in the broadcast. But thank you so much for sharing what is an incredible career with amazing, as I call it, at the coalface experience. This is not theoretical stuff. This is a guy that knows what he's talking about. And you made some fantastic points. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time.
Phil, thank you very much. And like I said, I'm a big fan. I watch everything that you put out, and it's again, I nod my head every time I see something, and I think we're brothers joined arms. And I'd love to join you for a beer as long as I don't have to eat cheese curds with it. I'm good with that. And I just the one bookend I'd love to add to our conversation is that today I looked up. I have a variety of sources I monitor, but as of today, since 9/11/2001, there have been 40,340 deadly jihadist attacks globally. And I think we've got to keep that up on the horizon and not take our eyes off that.
40th. Well, my friend, numbers speak volumes. And I think you've dotted the I and crossed the T, because this certainly is an indication, as we've both said, this thing hasn't gone away. So let's keep that in mind. So that was my conversation with Brig Barker, former FBI. What'd you think about what we had to say about Islamist extremism, radicalization? I'd love to hear your feedback. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at borealisaves. You'll find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more free of charge, go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You get a free daily digest, all the podcasts, all the blogs. There's also a link to my latest book, The Peaceable Kingdom, The History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present, as seen through the eyes of a practitioner. It's available on the website. Love to hear your feedback, ideas for other podcasts. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.